Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to have all of you here with us at IU's 11th lunch talk. By way of introduction, I'm Joe. I head the Independent Evaluation Unit, and it's a huge privilege to have all of you amongst us today. As you might know, the IU hosts monthly lunch talks. So we host them every month, and we host speakers who are essentially leaders in their fields, who come and talk to us about a diverse set of issues that relate not just to climate change, not just to evaluations, but also to development and really the way we think about a sustainable Earth. So really just about anything and everything. And while we've had very active participation from a lot of you in these series, we're also looking for your thoughts and ideas on what sorts of topics you'd like to see featured and what sorts of experts you'd like to see featured in these talks. For today's talk, the 11th talk of the IEU's Lunch Talk series, we're very privileged to have Director General David Molden from ICIMOD, who's here with us today, and has used his trip to the region to basically make it a point to come and visit us and be with us. David is a luminary in his field. Not only has he headed and he heads as Director General ICIMOD, which is a regional international organization that looks at countries in South Asia, right? South Asia, a subset of the countries in South Asia, where he's really striven to create a big force around evidence, around monitoring, around evaluation and learning, and has tried to emphasize that in action, so evidence-based learning and evidence-based action. But he's also made huge inroads into getting ICIMOD and organizations that affiliate themselves with ICIMOD to think about gender-inclusive development. And that's been one of his big stamps on the region as well as on the organization. I've been privileged to know David and ICIMOD from even before my time at GCF, when I went to talk about impact evaluation at David's outfit. So it's really nice to have David here as almost like a reciprocal gesture. Just before I hand over the mic to David, a few things about today's talk. As you might know, these talks are recorded. We do put them on our website. We also tweet them. We also use social media. So if while you're listening, you want to tweet, please use handle, hashtag, etc., and tweet it. Some research and impact evidence into this area has shown that people who tweet while talks are going on actually remember things much more than those who don't. So please do it. With that, few other things. Oh yes, IU also has a new website that I'm going to encourage you to look at. So it's iu.greenfund.org. Thank you. So definitely, I'm going to encourage you to take a look at it. And now over to David. Thank you so much, David. Again.
Okay. Wow, thank you. Thank you very much. Wonderful introduction. You can go ahead. Oh, I have to do that. Okay. Okay, what I'd like to do is go for a trip to the mountains, to the Hindu Kush Himalayan mountains. That sounds okay, doesn't it? And basically, I'll tell you what I'd like to pick out of this session. One is the importance of mountains in climate change and adaptation. That's number one. Second, the importance of regional collaboration in developing solutions, countries working together, working across borders, actually between countries, but also disciplines. And third, the kind of thinking about adaptation solutions and how they're so context specific, and I'll illustrate that with a few points. So let me just start with immediately an image of the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. I hope that's clear enough. But these are the mountains. That's probably Mount Everest in here. But if we start in Afghanistan, Hindu Kush Mountains, going up to the Karakoram Range, the Himalayan arc that goes clear over to Myanmar. Did you know Myanmar has a 6,000-foot peak? And then the associated hills, something like Chittagong Hill Tracts is down here, Chen State, Kachin State here, the Tibetan Plateau behind it. So this incredible geologic feature, in one way, has been a divide, right, between one climatic systems, wet and dry, also cultures, right, having to get over the mountains and interact. They do. But it's also mountains, what we found more recently, are meeting place where people can get together and think about issues. They're highly vulnerable to climate change and think about issues that we're facing today, how to get around that. This is a flattened out version of the region. 8 countries share this mountain resources, and they're all our member countries. So that's China, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. What we have done, 8 countries, about 240 million people living in the mountains, in the hills, in those regions, sharing the resource. What ISIMA, my organization, has done is to say, well, let's not look at mountains. We realize that mountains, the water towers, have impact downstream. So there are 10 major river basins that serve about 1.9 billion people. A quarter of humanity is dependent one way or the other on these mountain systems. The other interesting part is 8 of those 10 river basins are transboundaries, right? Countries share those river basins. And later we'll get into the climate change impacts on these river basins. It's a highly diverse region. And we had a colleague that counted 1,000 different languages, different living languages. Some of those are actually disappearing as we're moving into the future. But also, if we think about the traditional knowledge that people have held, it's a region very difficult to cope, very resilient people in many senses. But people have developed solutions to help adapt to their situation. And we believe that there is a lot of traditional knowledge in these mountain communities that can also help us as we're moving forward. Yet, poverty is high in the region. This is kind of our recent evidence base showing that mountain poverty is typically higher than on the plains. So the green is the national average and the yellow is the mountain people. Bhutan, it's about equal. India, curiously, a little bit higher in the plains. You have states like Bihar, but other countries, Nepal, much higher mountain poverty and quite high rates of income poverty, 30–40% in mountain areas. And we know that thinking about adaptation, there must be a relation between poverty and adaptive capacity. It's also the home of many highly diverse, biologically diverse. 4 of the 36 global hotspots are in this region. This particularly wonderful area where these 3 hotspots collide. Lots of biodiversity found in the area. I think when we're thinking about mountains and developing solutions, we really have to spend a lot of time thinking about ecosystems and ecology. These are species that are newly discovered. For example, it's hard to think that in 2010 a primate was discovered, actually in that region I was pointing out before. And one reason for saying that is basically our knowledge base in this region, the mountain region, is quite limited, in part because of accessibility. Hard to get data way out in the jungle or way up high at elevation. But we need to find that out when we're moving forward with climate change. It's also a region of high biological diversity. And again, it's those genes, that gene bank for the future, that we're going to need to preserve somehow moving forward. Now, this map shows population density, right? All the red dots, the Indo-Gangetic Plain, yellow and Yangtze River Basin plains. Curious, the mountains are just surrounded by high population density. And the implication, fewer people live in mountains, but policy decisions about mountains are often made in places like Delhi or Beijing or Islamabad, right? So the voice of mountain people is not that strong to think about issues. And so there is another role for evidence to policy, bring that to policymakers, bring that into debate and discussion. And that's a role, for example, that our organization does as well. So our argument here is that what happens in the mountains affects, yes, mountain people, 240 million people, but it also affects a quarter of the globe's population. And by extension, the world, if we think about issues like migration and conflict and energy as well. So let's think about the mountain areas. Like other places, it's climate change, but we have that interacting with a whole host of other drivers of change, population, urbanization. In the mountain areas, very high out-migration, especially of men, which has implication on women taking up more of the labor in mountain areas. And the issue is, yes, climate change is an important driver that we'll see, but it's interacting with all these other drivers of change. And Joe was mentioning, what about adaptation to climate change? And the issue is that all of these typically interact, so sometimes it's hard to pull out climate change and say our activity deals with climate change and not these other drivers. On top of that, we have many equity and sustainability challenges, and such as social inclusion and gender equality and malnourishment in the region. And in this particular region, the knowledge base is rather slim, and I even compare to regions like the Arctic as we're moving forward. Just as an example of a driver of change is hydropower development. So this is a map showing the circle is the potential, the blue part is what is developed. So in Myanmar, say 2% of the potential is developed. Even Bhutan, it has quite a bit, very little of the potential has been developed. So what we'll see as we're moving to the future is, well, there is pressure from a lot more hydropower development. Curiously, that pressure is lessening because of the development of solar power at the same time. But the question for mountain people is, do we get the benefits in the mountains? Because typically that electricity is going down to populated areas, and the valleys and the mountains are getting flooded. So how to share the benefit of hydropower development is a big question in the region. It's also, and this is what I'd like to argue, is that if we could cooperate on those rivers, we can get better developmental outcomes. Ultimately, I believe better adaptation as well. It's a particular area that actually, it used to be 4. I crossed it out, 2 of 8, or least developed countries. Bangladesh and Bhutan just graduated. Congratulations to them. And but it's also an area where there is a high degree of conflict. Area. Almost all the places, my gosh, we go to is a conflict area. And thinking about adaptation, certainly if you can deal with conflict, it must help with adapting to change as well. So we feel working across borders in many dimensions will help. Now what I want to do is to move to climate change. And this is one way to look at it. And it's the number of days with temperatures less than 30 degrees. And so that pink is like between 10 and 30, well, 1 to 10 days in the pink area. Where minimum temperatures, that's like nighttime temperatures are less than 30. So you have to think about sleeping, right, when it's 30 degrees. Hard to sleep. So here about 1 to 10 days are like that. So if we go out to the RCP 4.5, by 2050, the number of days with minimum temperatures less than 30 is 45 to 60.
What's RCP?
The concentration pathway. It's the global scenario of IPCC that leads you to the 2-degree world, approximately, right? So if we have a 2-degree global world, and by 2050 we'll be seeing many sleepless nights unless you put on your air conditioner, but I'm not sure that's a good adaptation strategy either. So So that's a real issue, but also think about crops, right? Agricultural patterns in the area as well. This is typically for the plains. Think about migration to mountains. I think we'll have more people going up to mountains. Right now, the migration pattern is the other direction. Now going to mountain areas, this is interesting, is there's the temperature change over the last 30 years. Up at 4,000 meters was about 0.2 degrees, whereas 1,000 and 0 is about 0.05. What that means is temperature rises faster at higher elevation. Temperature amplification at higher elevation. So what does that mean in the future if we could get to the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degree average world? What we see in the mountains is 1.8 plus or minus 0.4, so about 2 degrees in mountains. If we don't reach that and it's a 2 degree world, then what we could see is up to 4 degrees in mountain areas. So mountains, because of the temperatures getting faster, are hit. Actually, at 2 degrees, the Paris Agreement is already too hot for mountain areas. What you see already is people who grew apples down below. You can see, like in Mustang area, people know that. People are growing mountains and apples at higher and higher elevation already in mountain areas. So not necessarily a bad thing, but it's happening already. Mountains are highly vulnerable to climate change. So what is happening to climate and water resources? This photo was taken in 1921. That's Mount Everest on the north side, on the Tibetans on the Chinese side of the border, when George Mallory went to climb Mount Everest. And if we show the same photo in 2009, you can see what happened. I'll do that again, okay? Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Do it. Okay, we'll carry through those. Oh, you've got it. Jihee's on.
No.
He's got it sorted out. Keep going, Jihee.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one.
That one.
Okay, let's do that again.
And then go to slide.
Okay, go ahead and push the button. I don't want to push that.
Go back and then go.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, now what you do is like watch, just put your finger right here. You can see the incredible loss in vertical dimension as well as the shrinkage. This leaving behind what we call a glacier lake. And so what you see all over the Himalayas is that retreat, right, of glaciers and thinning of glaciers as well, and the increased danger of glacier lakes. And I just wanted to flash a report. I have these on the website or on the stick. This is the status of glacier lakes in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. So this is a direct, one thing about glaciers is they're a direct signal of climate change. And so when we're protecting glacier lakes, it's directly an adaptation to climate change. And this one identifies about 20 different dangerous glacier lakes in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. But what we're seeing in the future is more and more. And I believe GCF has projects to try and solve this by draining some of the lakes in the future. Okay, maybe.
You should be able to work it now.
Okay.
And,
Maybe you can help with me. Can you just push the button? Yeah.
It's working.
Okay. So this is one. So we have that image of glaciers retreating, and these dots, the yellow is the elevation difference. So the yellow and red, they're losing elevation. So that's happening all over that Hindu Kush Himalayan belt, right? All over, not just one place. And actually more shrinkage in that Myanmar eastern part of the HKH. Curiously, push the button again. In one region in Pakistan, in the Karakoram, some of the glaciers are advancing, and that nobody has quite figured out why that happens. And that's another presentation. But, and you might hear about it, the Karakoram anomaly, because some glaciers are actually advancing in the area. Now, on top of that, we have in the region, you also, I notice, have it here, air pollution. And one of the impacts of air pollution is it also is a temperature driver in the region. So it actually ultimately will heat up the temperature further. But some of that air pollution actually sits on the glaciers, makes it black, makes the glaciers melt faster, right? So it's a compounding effect, and something we also have to deal with when we're thinking about what to do with the glaciers. And here, this photo shows the air pollution sitting up way high in mountain areas. You thought you could go up and get some fresh air, but now more and more we're seeing the impacts of air pollution up high. But fortunately, it's not every day that air pollution gets up high. Now, so the question, and think about it, we have the water towers feeding 10 major river basins, 1.9 billion people. What's going to happen to those river basins? So we have, over the last, I would say about 10 years, actually made a lot of progress on the knowledge and thinking about that question. So one is, there's a loss of storage, right? Ice is a great way to store water. People talk about building dams. So we're losing our natural storage and wanting to build more and more dams. Second is, if you're very close to the glacier, you have a lot of problems. And I think it's something we have to deal with. We have to help people living very, very close to the glaciers and ice. Third is a little bit counterintuitive. Actually, the annual volume of those big rivers probably won't change that much. One reason for that is the climate change models show more rainfall in the future. So the volume we lose in ice and snow melt will be taken place by rain. That's not necessarily a good thing, right? Because what the models are predicting is that we'll have more intense rainfall and more drought periods. So the implication is more floods and droughts. Harder to manage the water when it comes in such extreme downpours. But what we will see is very much changing rainfall patterns and river flow patterns. So agriculturalist cities have to somehow adapt to that change, which is a result of climate change as well. So I believe there's a lot of adaptation work in the water management field as well. This is a photo from Ladakh, the valley, the irrigated valley of Nam. And basically, what have very little rainfall, right? Very dry, and people get their water from the glacier and snowmelt. And these glaciers are just a postage stamp left, almost nothing left of those glaciers. And so you do wonder, the fate of some of these beautiful mountain valleys like this. So going back then to the idea of more heavier rainfall. So we did some modeling recently that was asking the question, what about those extreme events? And what the modeling was telling us that the relative change in the 50-year return period would double. Let me translate that. So if you had a flood of, say, 10 cubic meters per second, that the 50-year flood, the one flood every 50 years, would be 20. So there's a doubling in magnitude of the size of floods that we can expect into the future. So what we expect, the main message is more floods, more droughts in the mountains and downstream into the future. Okay, I got it. And what we do see is floods is already an issue. And these are the disasters from floods and the number of people killed. Last year we had that big, huge flood that crossed Nepal, India, and Bangladesh. So basically to adapt, what we have to do is very much get ready for floods, keeping in mind that a lot of these floods cross national boundaries as well. So the question, these are gentlemen were from Pakistan. So they were asking on my trip there is, what do we do about it? And it was a great question. So they were asking two things. not what the world will help me, but they're saying, what do we do if the glaciers are retreating and we're having all this problem? The second question was about glaciers. How do they stop the glaciers from melting? And it's actually, there's nothing they can do themselves to stop the glaciers because it comes from the global greenhouse emissions. So there's a strong role for them to communicate their issues with the global community and for the global community to do something to help adapt to the situation. And of course, the other part we believe is change doesn't always have to be negative. There can be ways where we can figure out what to do a change and do something differently. We're talking about transformative change, right? Actually jumping from one state to another. So there are these opportunities that will come along with change, even in areas like tourism that can ultimately help us deal with climate change as well. I just tell about my center, International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. It's owned by these 8 countries that was mentioned. Senior government officials are on the board as well as advisors. This is I have to show a picture of our staff.
Yeah.
So that's part of our staff. That was International Women's Day. And so we have actually quite a nice compound. So I hope isn't that right, Joe? If you come by,
beautiful.
You should visit us. That was the Bangladesh pavilion that got damaged in the earthquake, not climate change, the earthquake. Well, what our role as an institute is, right, is somehow to get knowledge, evidence, linking with science partners, but turn that into action by dealing with practitioners and policymakers. So somehow bridging this place, between evidence and policy. We very much have a strong ME and learning division, and we have a strength at kind of doing planning for impact. So we use theory of change. We use impact pathway analysis to help projects deliver impact to help communities to adapt. And then on the road, we also do very much impact evaluation. I feel that we can work together with GCF on things like impact planning, training on capacity building for M&E, and doing these impact evaluations, but using those to learn to communicate with policymakers moving forward. Just as an example of the knowledge base, this recently a report came out on multidimensional poverty indicators, and they're nice because they cover things like education, health, living standard, accessibility, economic indicators, not just one dimension. And so they also help to track progress. And this is India, the mountain states in India, and the intensity, the percent of people that have very high multi-poverty index. And there you can see, map it out, the states of Northeast India typically are higher. Okay, one more. And then just to mention that you can track that index over time here. Okay, one more. I want to tell one last story. Go to the next one. Next one. I want to tell one story, 2 stories. So one is on the ground, if we're helping adaptation and resilience building, we have an example of solar pumps. And the key is not the technology, but in this case, the financial model that will help women. And the idea is, can we take that to mountain areas? This is from Pasu in Gilgit-Baltistan. This is an irrigation canal that when the glacier went down, the canal got dry, right? So people can't irrigate their fields anymore. And actually what we're doing is helping with putting in these solar pumps at high elevation to see if we can get an orchard started with the solar pumps. So I believe that's good adaptation. Let me do one more. So this is another example of adaptation. So we work a lot on flood early warning systems. We work formally with countries, but we wanted to see if we could do something with communities. So the thing was to get this community-based gadget, simple technology when the water goes up, the information is communicated to this woman, and she calls up everybody on her list, including the government, to basically run. That worked. That was in Assam. It worked. And the idea is, go ahead, see if I can make that work now. So we spread that. You can share knowledge and see if that can spread to other countries. In India, Bihar, that's Nitish's job, that's me. We were showing how that flood early warning system worked. The chief minister was quite interested in this. But the key was, could we do it across border between India and Nepal? So we set up a community-based flood early warning system in India, and then one in Nepal. And then this woman is a panchayat leader. She, from India, she came to Nepal and requested the Nepalese community, if that flood comes, to please give her a telephone call, right? So we didn't have to go through the government agency. And actually I was there, and about 3 months later, the flood came. Wow. And pretty devastating, but it worked. The community called the people in India, had 8 hours to basically pick up their bags and move to higher elevation. And what's interesting is that was a big task, but it was done by, yes, development NGOs, there are government officials involved as well, and the local communities. So doing adaptation solutions, you have to involve typically many, many people, and it's very context specific. And curiously, I was in Pakistan last month, and they had a big flood. And the Aga Khan Foundation adapted, this is that same gadget, right, that measures the flood. They had a flood, and the same thing worked, right? It actually worked in Pakistan too. So it's this interesting spread of knowledge, but adapted to local conditions. So if we're thinking about adaptation projects, sometimes it's difficult because you want the ideas to spread, but it has to be very local context driven, and it also needs many, many actors to develop those solutions. I think what I'll do is just stop right there, but argue that knowledge sharing is important, but I think it's important to have discussion too, Jill.
Yeah.
So I'll just stop.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, David. That was so wonderful. It's such a dense topic, and you definitely made it come alive for us. So the format is that we'll take 3 questions, get David to respond, and then another lot of 3 questions, and essentially we have about 20 minutes. So Yes, so if you could also introduce yourselves just in a line, and then please use the mic because we are recording, so it would be nice if you, yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. My name is Sang-Min Nam. I'm working with the UNSCAR East and Northeast Asia office. First, you were talking about this flooding, but I have seen reports on Croatia lake outburst flood.
Yeah.
So what is the magnitude of this Croatia lake outburst flood? That's my first question. And then regarding the work of Mode, we're talking about HKH as a water tower of 10 major rivers, including 8 transboundary rivers. So wondering whether Mode has any formal or informal arrangement with the government, especially intergovernmental commissions on those transboundary rivers. And then maybe last question is about black carbon. I mean, unlike many other greenhouse gases, black carbon is, those South Asian countries are, major contributor to black carbon on the fountain. So wondering how you work with those countries on. You were talking about the knowledge sharing and communications in that context. How would you do that?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Anyone else, or have you exhausted the 3 questions? No, I think we can. Okay. Go for it. No, go for it, Susan.
I was struck by the fact that you were talking about hydroelectric power, because obviously on some things it's a renewable energy, quite positive. But I also, there's a lot of people who also talk about the impacts on communities, sometimes requiring massive relocation of people, or impacts on biodiversity. And so,
Yeah.
and then the other thing is I've been hearing a lot lately that in a lot of modeling for countries, because rainfall is going to be so variable with climate change, you may invest a lot in a dam, and then you don't actually have the resources, or the floods have an impact on the dam. And so, could you talk a little bit of how hydroelectric power fits in within the climate change?
Yeah.
Yeah, please, Sarah, go for it.
For the
Could you put on the mic?
for the sustainable development goals, I'm interested, and I'll speak with you more after as well. How has ECMOD engaged thus far into the SDGs debate for these landlocked countries, especially? Because the LLDCs really have a special focus area, and so I think that this work is really interesting from that perspective.
Okay.
Go for it.
Okay. Good.
Right here. Can we take this?
Okay. Yeah. So was your question on what's the mechanism for glacier lake outbursts? What?
Maybe frequency or magnitude of
Yeah.
glacier lake.
Yeah. The frequency, is not so frequent. So if I think in Nepal, there was one a couple of years ago, then about 10 years ago. If I think in Pakistan, so it's on the order of years, right? But that will increase, right? Because we're seeing more and more of these glacier lakes getting bigger and bigger. Number two is in Pakistan, there's a lot, right? All the time. It comes every year. But they're different in that you don't see the lake, the water's inside the glacier, and that water bursts out. So quite frequent in that on the western side. The HKH as a water tower. So a big issue is that the countries typically do not cooperate around water. And so what we do is we try to find entry points for cooperation. And one of those entry points is floods, right? Because India has a great interest in what's happening in Nepal and China to reduce the impact of floods. So I think there's a way to cooperate. It's interesting that countries also have an interest in what's happening to the glaciers. So those are some entry points into cooperation. I just came last week at our office. We had a meeting, Upper Indus Basin meeting between Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and China on the Indus River. But there people were willing to talk about knowledge, science, and climate change. So actually it's interesting that climate change has brought people together in the region who have difficulty talking. The difficult discussion is sharing water, right? How many cubic meters of water one country should get versus the other. I think if we can take these steps, we can ultimately get into better arrangements between countries. An important role for mountains. The third was on black carbon, but I'm forgetting exactly the question.
Unlike many other greenhouse gases,
Yeah.
This South Asian countries are also major source of carbon for.
Exactly. So what we see is say brick kilns, agriculture burning, forest fire, dirty diesel fuel. It's all emitting air pollution and black carbon. Remember that photo of that smoke getting up into the mountains. So again, it's a regional issue. It's a transboundary issue, but it's something I just can't imagine that. I think it's one you're starting to see people wanting to do something about, because especially the health impacts of black carbon. So we're working on the brick kilns. It's quite interesting. In Nepal, after the earthquake, we have seen some of our work is to get people to change into cleaner technologies. That worked, It was interesting. The Pakistanis also saw that and are now changing to cleaner technologies. But it's a huge issue, and it relates definitely to climate adaptation because black carbon is also a climate forcer and people's health, and it's all kinds of co-impacts as well. There was something on hydro, I hope I answered, but there was something on hydroelectricity. And so many people, of course, see that as a clean energy measure as opposed to burning coal, for example. But you're right, it's a huge issue, and the socioeconomic part and the environmental part is big, especially in mountain. Where do you put hydropower? You put it in mountains and hills. And so what we go into that with is a benefit sharing framework, right? Looking at who is benefiting from the development. So for example, can electric power, Bhutan does this quite well, as houses get the benefit of electric power in Bhutan. Are people having a share in the wealth generated from hydropower? But it's, and also there's a big job, I know in Nepal on environmental impact, they had one way to do an environmental impact assessment, regardless whether it was roads, whether it was hydropower, whether it was building. So we worked with we worked on developing a hydropower specific environmental impact. In the future, again, with the climate change, there'll be more variability. So sometimes you get, the question is, will they be viable? And typically, I mean, hydropower plants run of the river anyway generate a lot of electricity for 3 or 4 or 5 months, and then not so much later. But it looks like because of the rainfall, that's what I was saying, annual volume will be enough. So the few plants we've studied, that's not a big impact. Where I worry more about is, are they safe given earthquakes and given these bluffs? So one of the things, I mean, these glacier lakes have the potential of knocking out, glacier lake outburst floods could knock out some of these hydropower. Well, the SDGs in countries, ICIMOD has a very close relation and has worked a lot with like the LEG and the LDC countries on the SDGs. So we're very closely involved in discussion with governments. But yes, it's prime location for all of these SDGs as we're moving forward. I don't know if I answered sufficiently what you want, but it's a big task to do for sure.
Thank you, David. Yeah, Linus.
This is Linus. I'm from Bhutan.
Can you come closer? Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question on the monitoring and evaluation.
Yeah.
I'm saying this because we are in the midst of defining indicators for the visual framework.
Yeah.
And some of the challenges that they're facing is not so much on mitigation, but on adaptation.
Yeah.
And as you said, it's very context specific.
Yeah.
And as this GCF as a fund, it's aggregated.
Yeah.
They make it help us in a broader sense.
Yeah.
So it's striking the right balance is a challenge.
Yeah.
So if you could just talk about that issue. And also once it's defined, we also need to communicate it for AEs, partners, how we can do it effectively for that matter. I think that'll be
that's a great question.
Thanks, Linus. Anyone else? Yes, please. Thank you.
This is Shamir from Independent Witness Mechanism. Thank you for your talk. I believe there are a number of indigenous or ethnic communities that live along the HBH belt. So I think in recent years there has been increasing importance about how native people or the local people has kind of historically managed the natural resources and the local indigenous knowledges. So I was curious about, have you had any findings, or if you have any thoughts about the people who are living in this belt? What are the knowledge they have when it comes about climate change adaptation as well as natural?
Okay.
That's 3. Do you want to take those and then?
Those were 2. too that I can do.
Oh, right, sorry.
That I've recorded, but I can do those. The first question is what I see the difficulty, like what you do in Green Climate Fund is you have large chunks of money. And, when I present climate change, like here's what's happening to the glaciers, you can get one picture. As soon as you present adaptation, it's so context specific that you really have to go almost place by place. So and we know there's a real danger of blanket approaches, right? They probably waste the money to do that. So how do you develop indicators? And I think it probably is I know what we do is we do a cascading approach. So we'll have program indicators. Yes, we'd like to improve income. We'd like that more women can be safe women and men can be safe from floods. But then I think for each of those project sites, you have to, again, do that impact. You have to do it for each community or small area you go to. I don't think GCF has to do that, but your partners have to do that, who's trained. So they have to be trained in what's your theory of change, what's your impact pathway, who do you need to influence, what results and intermediate results you have to get. So your partners have to be skilled in doing that. That's why I think it's so important to have this training in both the planning and the M&E and learning so that you can do these very context-specific situations. The partners have to be good at it. Then you have to aggregate that up to yourself. That would be my opinion on how to do that. And then there was a question on, I put that 1,000 living languages, so much traditional knowledge and indigenous people who are typically, I have to say that, but there's a lot of marginalization of indigenous people in the region. So a lot of times, say, the impact of hydropower is right in some of those communities where indigenous people are. So there's a lot of things to do. One is to make sure we appreciate the traditional knowledge of people, because a lot of times it is unique solutions developed there. An example is the food, right? Now we want more and more nutritious food going forward. Where do you find that? A lot of this is mountain. Think of quinoa from Peru or something like that. That I think we can appreciate that knowledge in mountains, document it, make sure we're sharing the benefits of that knowledge, access and benefit sharing with local communities. Giving voice, making sure people have voice, and decisions made about projects is very, very important in these areas. So I think it is, again, a role in the project design and evaluation to make sure you're hearing local people voices in that area. But it's huge in that. It's significant in the mountain areas, working with indigenous and people and local knowledge.
Ali, go for it. Come to the mic. Yeah.
Thank you, David. We have been talking for this morning, but I want to ask you the one question about how are you making the stakeholder engagement in the process? Is there any kind of success from your organization by doing those kind of mountains projects in terms of adaptation or climate change resilience? Did you have a chance to bring those topic or strategy in the national level with those governments?
Yeah.
And how you are doing this and what is the mechanism of it?
Yeah. Thanks. There's a nice last one. Okay.
Yes,
one
please.
More question or just
I think this is good.
So part of the
last slide. Did you want the last?
Oh yeah,
slide?
just because it's a nice looking. You can leave. Oh, where's that mic?
Oh yeah.
What did they do with it? Okay. Okay. Actually, a lot of the issue with mountains too is that I remember the Pakistan agricultural policy had nothing about mountains. That the agriculture is so specific. Same with Bangladesh, Ali, your country. Chittagong Hill Tracts was kind of left out, in the considerations they would have in the 5-year plan. And so there's two roles. Yes, I gave that example of flood early warning systems and the solar pumps, right? And we have I had more examples on climate smart agriculture, on using remittances for migration. But the other key is to link up with policymakers such that that gets in their national adaptation strategy and plans. So for ICIMOD, we're connected because we're intergovernmental to government organizations. The job is really to make sure that gets into policy. And for us, it would be great if governments would ask GCF for funding to outscale some of these activities. That's the way I see it going. But to do that, ICIMOD and other organizations like ours have to demonstrate innovations that they work, have to get the evidence that they really work, right? And take that to governments, that governments put that as part of their plans and programs. Apply for funding like through your mechanism as well here. So it's a road. So I think for us, by the way, an organization like ICIMOD, we somehow would like to be able to play that role of innovations, evaluation, engagement with government, helping partners in their impact planning. I do believe there are a lot of organizations like ours that can really play a good role as well with GCF.
Okay, with that, thank you so much, David. Did you want to talk about anything else?
Yeah, why don't you show the last
please
picture?
show the last picture.
This because it's a nice one.
Oh,
I have to leave on it. This is Mount Kailash. Do you know? Does anybody know?
Yes.
Yeah. You know.
Yeah.
Are you ever?
I haven't been there, but it's amongst my bucket list thing.
Bucket list.
Yes.
So this one, it's important, like for at least 4 different religions, right? And it's also just nearby as the source of water for Ganges, Brahmaputra River. So it's a very special place. Leave you with the blessings of Brahmaputra.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. Again. So just to close this, actually, so the IU has a partnership MOU with ICIMOD, and through that we want to explore some of these things that David mentioned, which are on capacity building, on getting advice, on training, and then also building further linkages with organizations on the ground, thinking with them and developing with them ideas around evaluation, learning, etc. So yeah, looking forward to a further association.
Okay,
thanks again.
Good, thank you.
And then for all of you to know that our next IU talk will be on the 28th of May, and we will be talking about impact evaluation and what we can do better with GCF projects. So we'll send a note around, but please mark your calendars. And with that, David, I do want to say that if some of you have burning questions that you really, really want to talk to David about, he has probably a couple of slots this afternoon that you can either get in touch with Ali or Jihi, and she'll try and organize some bilateral chats between you and David. Yep. And with that, David, thank you very much
Thanks.
again.
And